Orijit Sen is a graphic artist, muralist, cartoonist, and designer based in Goa, India. He is a co-founder of People Tree, a collaborative studio and store for artists, designers, and craftspeople. Orijit is the author of River of Stories, Kalpavriksha, 1994, a fictionalized account of the powerful environmental movements led by the indigenous people of the Narmada Valley in central India in the 1980s and 90s. River of Stories is considered to be India's first graphic novel. Orijit is also the co-founder of the Power Collective of graphic artists. In 2021, Orijit launched Comic Sense, a comics quarterly for young readers in collaboration with Ektara Trust, and is its chief editor. A.P Payal is a doctoral scholar researching the politics of gender in the Tarot at the Department of English, University of Delhi. She is an artist, and her maiden graphic narrative was published in First Hand, Graphic Nonfiction from India 2016. She has since independently authored and published Hirsutism, Unforgettable, and Warp and Weft. Visuality is a key part of her pedagogy in the university classroom. The audience is free to turn their camera on, but they should stay on mute for now to avoid any disturbance. The floor will be open for questions for all after the discussion. Handing it over to Payal ma'am now.
Good evening, Rahee. Good evening, Orijit. Good evening, students and faculty. I'm very excited to be here as both somebody who teaches graphic narratives and who has been making comics. It's also a personal pleasure to be on this discussion with Orijit because he was the editor who helped edit my first piece that got published. So it's really nice to meet again like this. So as the panel discussion, the topic really is we're looking at visuality and narratives of resistance. I'd like to just begin with a quotation by eminent author Zora Neale Hurston, and it reads like this: "If you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." This is something that I read when I was an undergrad student, and it really stayed with me for a very long time. This idea of, to experience trauma is one thing, to experience violence is one thing, but very often, personally or politically, it is sometimes difficult to articulate that resistance or that pain or that experience of pain. But what Hurston is really talking about here is the importance of narrativizing one's pain, not just in order to stop it, but also in order to document it. And I would think that this is really where the discussion for today takes off from, or I'm hoping, based on both Orijit's work and Rahee's work. What we know, what we've seen of it, either we've read it or seen it available online by way of exhibitions or comics, or maybe we follow them on Instagram. So especially when we're talking about stories of resistance, where is this? When the moment you think about resistance, you also have a clear understanding that there is there is a power that is dominant, and then there are narratives which give us an alternative to that dominant narrative. So how does one negotiate that kind of tension? How does one tell these stories, especially when there is even more danger of effacement? And what are the politics of that when one is a visual artist? How does one integrate one's art practice? So here's looking forward to the discussion, opening up all of this. We'll begin with a short presentation by Orijit, followed by which we'll open the discussion. I have some questions of my own, and the students from Miranda have already sent in their questions. So I'll sort of open up the discussion from there, and then we can open the question for the audience as well by the end of the event. So Orijit, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Payal. Pleasure to meet you too again, and all the students present here, and Rahee, my co-presenter today. I'm really glad and happy to be here. Mm, I just have a word of caution because it seems my internet connection is not behaving too good right now. So I'm going to launch into it, but please bear with me in case I get cut off. I'm going to try to rejoin or whatever. I just hope, fingers crossed, that it keeps going fine. Shall I present my work right now?
Yeah, Orijit, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Can you see the page
Yeah,
on
we
my
can see
screen?
your screen. We can see your screen.
Okay. So in case I get cut off because, for whatever reason, I don't have the option of presenting just a window. So I have to occupy my screen with my presentation and not see, I can't see the window in which all of you are there. So in case the internet goes off, please warn me somehow. You can call me and tell me that it's gone or whatever.
Okay.
Because I've had this happen sometimes when I'm talking about something and I can't see the audience. And after a while, I realize that, hey, I'm just talking into thin air because the connection's gone. So
Right.
just letting you know.
Right.
All right.
So we'll have the students call you if that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. All right. So let me go right away into it. I just have a selection of short and longish works that I've done over time. I'm not showing any of my any full length work because I think that would just take too much time in context of today's thing, which is more about discussion. And this is just like a broad introduction to some of my work to those who may not be familiar with it. So my first piece that I'd like to show today is called Hair Burns Like Grass. And it's an excerpt from a longer work which deals with the poetry and the figure of Kabir in the 15th century poet, who not much is known about in factual terms because he's quite a mysterious figure that way. But there's a lot of mythology and narratives and stories about him. We do have a huge body of work that purports to be Kabir's poetry, but we also do not today, in the sense of in the sense of actual scholarship, as in terms of academic scholarship, not much of it can necessarily, because he was an oral he was part of the oral tradition. He didn't write his poetry, and his poetry just went from word of mouth to word of mouth. I mean, passed from person to person, and it was almost 200 years since after his life, after he died, that uh, his poems were first set down on paper, and therefore we really cannot say authentically exactly what Kabir may have written or what was transformed over the years. However, that is what makes this body of work very interesting in itself, because of the mysteriousness of the creator and how little we are able to factually determine about his life. And yet it's a body of work that has sustained itself over many centuries. It grows powerful with the passage of time, in fact. And this is what is so amazing. It is really, I would say, the poetry of people, like a communal group of community of people, rather than of an individual. And if we approach Kabir's poetry from that perspective, I think it gives us a deeper sense of what this body of work actually means in today's context. He spoke out against a lot of course, religious divides. He spoke out against casteism. He spoke out against many very important social issues of the day. And he was a very powerful voice, which is quite amazing that a voice from the 15th century uh, can speak so powerfully to our modern sensibilities. So anyway, that's just an introduction background to Kabir, or what I approach, why I drew this about Kabir, why I'm fascinated by Kabir. And here's a few pages of the book. So I wove together many different strands of narrative. One was about Kabir himself and his life, or rather what we know of his life, the myths and legends getting equal share of space along with the academic narrative, which is actually very sparse because we don't know too much documented reality about Kabir. So the myths and narratives from different times in history and from different communities, they sort of flow into this idea of who was Kabir. And we can't, so I have sort of included different types of narratives to explain who Kabir was. And
I think we've lost Orijit's audio.
Yes, ma'am. I'll just call him once. I'll try.
Yeah, perhaps you could suggest to him that while he's presenting, he could maybe mute his video so that the internet is used only for the audio. Thanks.
Sure.
a daughter or daughter-in-law, we don't know. I mean, we don't, the reader, I mean, I don't go into their relationship as so much as that this two people who have a kind of obviously a shared history because they know certain things about each other, and yet it's really a relationship between a young alive person with an old dying person, and how Kabir's poetry sort of flows through the realities of both these characters. So this is another thread. So there are different threads here. So my story sort of moves back and forth between these different threads. And his poetry is always ever present. Yes.
Orijit, 1 second. Actually, we lost your audio in between. So do you think it would be possible for you to just switch off your video so we can just, so the internet is just focused on your screen?
Yeah, I should do that. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Hopefully this will be better. Yeah. So, okay, since the time thing, I won't go back into repeating what I said. Doesn't matter. We can also address some of these in question and answer if that comes up.
Yes, thank you.
So, this story of mine sort of works around both languages, as in Hindi and English. Although I really love the cadence and the rhythm of the poetry, of Kabir's poetry in Hindi. However, I should warn you that Kabir did not write in Hindi. He in fact spoke a language which must have been closer to Pali, to Prakrit, and maybe Bhojpuri. I mean, since we don't really know his exact cultural background, except in his own poetry, he refers to Banaras often. And even that, I don't know whether it's always literally Banaras or Banaras is like a metaphor for for death and life and other things that concern Kabir. However, we can place him in Banaras, so in the 15th century. So it's certainly not Hindi as we know it today that he composed his poetry in. But however, there do exist Hindi versions of his poetry, and they still would be closer, obviously, to Kabir's original work than, let's say, what we have in English. So I have the story itself is largely English, but I've retained throughout the poetry in Hindi as well as English. So readers who can read Hindi can get a sense of the poetry in Hindi at least. So anyway, so here we begin with this old man on a wheelchair. So he
Guys, I think you'll need to just let Orijit know.
Just texting him right now. Just call him.
Thanks.
Kind of geographies of time and place. And I'll just take you through a few of the pages slowly. I'm not going to explain too much because that would really take long. But as you can see, the registers keep shifting. As you turn a page, you might start reading about Kabir's, about a history or a historical presentation of Kabir from an academic perspective or from the in terms of images from miniature paintings, like what you see on the left-hand page of Kabir the Weaver is a miniature from the 19th century. So also not really by any means an authentic representation of Kabir, something painted more than 400 years after he lived. But by our interpretation, this is an old and one of the oldest known representations of Kabir. So we often base our contemporary images of Kabir around that figure. And the other representation of Kabir you see here, where he is meditating on a mat with his white conical hat, is a calendar art representation of Kabir made by a community of followers of Kabir called Kabir Panthis. The Kabir Panthis think of Kabir as a sacred figure and spiritual master, and they are based around Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh and a few other regions of central India, and they have this they have their own set of iconography around Kabir, his birth, and his saintly status, and so on and so forth. So I'm contrasting now. This is a 20th century representation on the right, and 19th century, or rather 18th century representation on the left. So it's sort of neither of them are accurate by any means to what Kabir would have been like, but they both represent two very different takes on Kabir. And I thought that it's really, and in a way, I might as well let the cat out of the bag, is that for me, this old man who's on his deathbed in Gurgaon is my representation of Kabir. So it kind of moves between different ideas of representation. So anyway, this young woman keeps looking after the old man and tries to cater to his needs and tries to respond to his sort of somewhat irrational demands, or the kind of things he says, make sense of the things he says. So in one process, he mentions some photograph of his childhood, and he wants her to find it. And then she goes looking for it, and she unearths something else. She finds this picture of this young boy in front of an old Haveli in Manaras with a monkey tied on a chain. Now this, somewhere else in the book, a poem by Kabir, which refers to the mind as a monkey, and that those who can't deal with the unpredictable wildness of the monkey are always taught to chain it, and keep it under control, referring to the mind, of course. So in a way, it's like a visual representation of a metaphor that Kabir himself uses elsewhere, which the reader of this book will see later in the book. And at this moment, he or she does not know that this is that connection happens later. So that's the other thing. I'll just as a by the way, I like to kind of use the back and forth quality of comics, where you can move back and forth in time, and where every moment in time is actually laid out in space. I mean, there's no other medium that can move back and forth in this way. For example, in cinema, you see one moment, and the next moment will come and obliterate the previous moment. You cannot go back to it. But comics actually encourages a sort of non-linear reading as a form. It's designed for that, and I try to make full use of those aspects of the medium in my work. So we shift again to try to explain some of the concepts in Kabir's poetry, and also to understand what Kabir means in today's world. So I see him, if you remember, the title of this chapter is The Poet Who Became a Tree. And this is how it happens. As we see Kabir as represented as a tree, but as we pull out, we start to see that there are many trees. And then we pull out further, we see that actually there are leaves in the branches of a tree. And then as we pull out even further, we see finally that it's a tree that is composed of many trees. And in the many trees, that big tree supports a community of people. And this is literally a representation of I mean, while it's a metaphorical representation of Kabir and his place in the modern world in today's India, but it's also literally a representation of a typical evening satsang that happens where with the followers of Kabir who come and sing Kabir bhajans, and the villagers gather around under a tree and might go on through the night as they sing Kabir songs. And also the singers usually take care to interpret the lyrics of the songs or add their own subtext to it. And this is how Kabir's poetry still carries on in the oral tradition from word of mouth. And where also every person who retells these poems or stories might change the inflection, might add a word, might shape something differently, or create some contemporary specific cultural context. And therefore, that poetry is very, it's flexible, it's resilient, and his poetry keeps adapting. It's not like the poetry of, let's say, a poet who has been written down and put into text, and therefore there already exists one standardized, authorized version of that poem. Kabir has this flexibility where people can keep on interpreting him, and that's probably also why it's so alive today. Anyway, so we go back and forth, and this old man is now hallucinating. He's being taken out for a morning walk from his apartment, and there's an attendant who comes and takes him out and so on and so forth. But he is gone into an hallucinatory phase of another part of his life, and he dreams of himself on a motorbike, and he dreams of this woman that who was somehow associated with his experience of being on this motorbike. And he starts talking about the woman, and the attendant who's pushing his wheelchair sort of humors him and say, "Hey, you're talking about a woman, but I don't see anyone." But for this old man, the woman is very real. She's sitting right there on the bench in front of him. And as he watches, the paisley pattern print on her sari starts flying off. So there's so much of references to death and to this idea of Banaras, and because Kabir's poetry has a lot of focus on the idea of death and dealing with this notion of death. So much so that some people have called him the poet of death. And so anyway, so then also his poetry keeps on appearing in Hindi throughout. Maybe in this little small screen, you can't really see it in detail, but if I zoom in here, you see, for example, you see that railing there, the park railing, and his poetry in Hindi has become part of the railing. And then elsewhere, it appears as written on the branch of the tree. So just as in the earlier segment, his poetry was written on that rock on which he was sitting. Anyway, so Kabir's poetry keeps appearing like that. This is something that refers to the birth legend about Kabir, which the Kabir Panthis believe in, about him having taken kind of miraculous birth on a lotus flower in a particular lake, which is identified in this town in Uttar Pradesh. And then there are other versions of that same story, where in another version where he is said to have been found floating on a lake, on a lotus on a lake, but by this couple who seem to have in the stories that different versions, but the couple seem to have a cross-cultural connection. Either the wife was originally Hindu and then transformed and then converted to Islam to marry this man who's a trader, and this couple finds Kabir. So there was somehow, obviously, there is this sort of a deeply set into the original.
Orijit, I'm not sure if you can hear us, but we've lost your audio.
Both Hindu, and you see on the right hand page, the Hindu priests and uh, the sort of temple people in Banaras wanted to appropriate him, while the Muslim sort of religious institutions also wanted to claim, want to make a claim. So, but Kabir simply kind of defies, even as a child, he defies these sort of counterclaims on him and refuses to become part of either identity, or he's happy to actually take on both and still not limit himself to either. And there are poems by him which kind of attest to that particular aspect. So I've included that here, like a quote from one of his poems, which is written in here in Hindi. It says, "Hindu kaho to hu nahi, Musalman bhi nahi, गैवी दोनों दीन में, खोलू दोनों, खेलू दोनों माही." Like I am neither one nor the other. I play in both, and I believe in the the aura of both, and yet I play in both. I don't believe it. I don't go in either camp. Both these people, both these religions or spirituality, kinds of spirituality hold truth for me, but they are not the entire truth. Anyway, so the story goes so, and then I use certain kind of moments and metaphors to cut from one element to the other. For example, here we're still talking about Kabir and his childhood as explained by different communities and different storytellers over time. And then we see him playing with a kite, and then the kite becomes a way for us to cut to back to the story of this old man and his hallucinations. And now he's thinking of his childhood in Banaras on a rooftop flying a kite. And when he hears the news of his mother's death, and this is a kind of sequence where we see his uncle Mamu. You can see as he and his sister are busy flying the kite, the uncle appears in the background, comes up to take them to the other house where the mother is dead now. And just as he sees his mother's body on the bed, somebody's kite gets cut, and we have this aerial view of Banaras with kites being flown, and somebody shouting "Kati," which is what they shout when they battle with kites.
Orijit, would it be okay if we pause the presentation now and we open this up for discussion, because you've shared such rich visuals with us?
Yeah.
Let's leave it some
Yeah, sure.
time.
Absolutely.
Would it be okay?
No problem. Let's do that.
Okay. So thank you so much for sharing these wonderful visuals with us.
My pleasure.
And you know, at Delhi University now we have a dedicated paper for graphic narratives that is offered to both students from the English discipline, like English honors, and also for students outside of English honors.
Right.
So I think our students will really benefit from the commentary, like the way you said about, you know, constantly shifting back and forth, the non-linearity that is enabled through comics. So I think, and you know what you like towards the end, like one, of course, I think everybody was very appreciative of the satsang image that you showed us, you know, the silhouette, the tree. And you know how it resists, like how Kabir, despite being this amorphous figure, extends this tremendous cultural influence and is also defied, because like you rightly pointed out through your graphic narrative, that members of different communities often try to co-opt.
Yes.
And there's a way that, you know, like and I love the way you linked it to the kite, because essentially the dhaga or the thread, Kabir's thread can't be held by any one community. And I think that you really captured that very well with the visuals. So thanks.
Thank you.
I think I would like to now just ask Rahee a few questions about his art practice. So, Rahee, why don't you just start by perhaps talking to us about your moniker, Art Taker? I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. If you could just talk.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Yes, there is hardly anything, like mysterious or deep about it. It's essentially a portmanteau of two words. One is art and the other is Ambedkar, and I just like coalesce them together, and that's Artedkar. So, yeah, that's the brief answer to that. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. So you are someone who is working with drawing, with still drawing, but also somebody who's worked with film. So perhaps if you could talk to us, because Orijit has just spoken to us about comics and how comics can work to narrativize stories of resistance. So if you could talk to us from the perspective of your art practice.
Right.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, I might also have the same problem that Orijit had. So please just text me and I'll just shut my video off in case of any lag. Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, this is something that I would start my start this with, which is that when you come from a particular community, like I mean, like the way the dynamics of this nation, the like democratic public sphere of this country has been set up, like it just so happens that when you are somebody who speaks about certain things while belonging to a particular milieu, you automatically get classified as somebody who's making protest art, right? Doing resistance, right? Drawing resistance. Whereas when somebody who belongs to another community, and in most cases, the people who are burdened with the automatic assumption of being resistors are people who belong to Dal communities, Adivasi communities, and so on and so forth, right? And the people who would conversely be possibly talking about the same things while also including like some sort of an existential angle, some sort of depth of examination and so on and so forth while belonging to upper caste communities, or like urban upper class elite communities, they would tend to be seen as doing something that is not directly it's like there would be some sort of like alleged nuance to it, like where there is the sort of depth, and the protest part, the dissent part, the resistance part is only one layer among many others, where when it's somebody who belongs to a DBA community, like it happens to that's sort of the assumption, right? And yeah, so that's something that I actually was struggling a lot with in the beginning of like my practice, in the beginning of my practice, especially vis-a-vis art editor, because my art practice has been in a very different like from a very different angle, which I will talk about briefly. And what I essentially want to address through my art practice online as with the moniker Artedkar is to talk about this to so okay, so I'll just start with like what my beginnings are. In the beginning, like my arts practice begins as an experimental filmmaker, and my works were not political to say the least, in the sense of like what I was essentially were like interested in, and what I still am in many ways interested in, is the abstract. And at one point, during 2013-14, there was this sort of zeitgeist where film reels were going out of practice, so essentially before like the 2010s, before the ascent of the digital media, before the ascent of HD cams and so on and so forth. There used to be and DCPs and so on and so forth. There used to be like films would be both shot and projected using film reels, right? And that sort of like slowly went out of practice like around that point. It had like gradually gained steam, like the going out of practice was gaining steam, but I think 2013-14 was like the final sort of like death knell, because Kodak, the company which was producing the primary producer of the reels at that point, went bankrupt, and like they shut down the last factory, right? So at that point, as experimental filmmakers, like experimental films, as like some of you may know, like tend to sort of foreground and highlight the materiality of the medium itself, right? Like it's about highlighting the medium itself, like the formal aspects of the medium itself. And so when we are speaking about the film reel, naturally, like like a medium which was going out of practice, there was a lot of questions being raised. There was a lot of nostalgia being brewed, and experimental filmmakers were particularly speaking about that at that point of time by talking about how like the film reel, for example, has a very very unique sort of material praxis to it, where like there is the like uniqueness of the texture, the way the light interacts with the film reel. For example, the same film which has been made, like the reels have been produced, let's say in 1970s, and the same reel which now has been transferred to two different places. From, let's say, Bombay, it has been transferred, one reel has been transferred to, let's say, Bhubaneswar, and the other reel has been transferred to Delhi. But after 30 years of interacting with the projector as well as the light, like the tinges that these both reels would have is completely different now. So that's the sort of uniqueness that the material used to possess, and that is essentially something that we were going to lose when the digital came in, because digital is like obviously reduplicable, and like these unique intricacies are going to get lost, right? So yeah, so my work at that point, also, like this is something that if you don't know, like film reels, and to even procure 35mm reels, etc., like was an expensive endeavor, right? Yeah, so a lot of the questions that were being asked, and the nostalgia that was being brewed, was being done from a position which was primarily first world, the history of like film artists collectives who had access to 16mm reels and so on and so forth. So yeah, so like as somebody who was sitting in India, like from a marginalized like community and so on and so forth, like like how do I interact with like my interaction with this sort of zeitgeist was very different. My interpretation of how the digital media is going to harbor this sort of new change that we are talking about, like that was very different. So like my films were primarily experimental films dealing with that particular movement, right? Because so yeah, so this is a this is a markedly different territory from like what I do now, which is make figurative art, primarily figurative art based within the anti-caste discourse. So like so like there is this sort of um unease about this from my own part, because like ideally what I would like to do as an artist is to continue that sort of tradition using Ambedkarite art motifs, right? Like so like talk about that very particular specific specifically experimental motifs, the materiality of the medium, and like the abstractions and so on and so forth. Like ideally I would want to continue to do that, but the problem then comes up with what kind of repository of art images do we possess in the common conception, right? So obviously like even though there has been so much anti-caste discourse, and anti-caste movements, and like anti-caste art which has been produced in the country, invariably what has happened is either it has been erased, backgrounded, or conversely it has been co-opted and appropriated by like elite and upper caste practitioners to signify something which it originally did not intend to, right? So in that sense, essentially there is this sort of buffer zone where I mean, like case in point, for example, when we think of Dr. Ambedkar, who was like one of the most fundamental figures of 20th century modernity in South Asia, uh, the when we compare the imagery of Dr. Ambedkar and how we see those images, what we have are the most famous or familiar images that we have are the statues, are the statues of Ambedkar. Whereas but there are no other visual images beyond that, largely speaking, right, in the public sphere, so to speak. Whereas when we compare that, when we think of someone like Gandhi, almost every major modern artist, contemporary painter has created an image of Mahatma Gandhi, right? Whereas nobody has done the same with Dr. Ambedkar, right? Whereas nobody has done the same with like Mahatma Phule. Whereas nobody has done the same with like a lot of Dalit women who have been at the foreground of a lot of movements, right? Yeah, so what I essentially want to do is is in opposition to what I require to be able to do that, which is that, if I want to, historically progress to this point where I can draw from Ambedkarite motifs, to create art which is abstract, I will need that sort of, existent repository of images to draw from, right? So in that sense, what I do now is basically filling that buffer zone, which unfortunately still exists, where I have to take up the responsibility, as with a lot of artists from marginalized communities in India. We have to first find and found those uh, basic images first and foremost, because they simply have not yet existed. And this is something this is some like a place where one can perhaps make this sort of pun, where when we talk of graphic art, ironically, the sustenance of the public sphere in this country has been through portraying the Dalit, the Adivasi, the disenfranchised in the most graphic of ways, right? There is almost no, I mean, and this is something that we saw over and over, from beginning from images of someone like Nangeli, who's from the 19th century to this point, when in Hathras, they're whenever there is some sort of violation of the dignity of Dalit bodies and Adivasi bodies happens, it has to be portrayed in a graphic way. There has not been, due to, obviously, if a Dalit artist or an Adivasi artist were to portray this image, the very pain of the graphicness of the image is going to force them to alter the way the aesthetics are being conformed, the aesthetics are being drawn. Whereas it almost feels like there is this sustenance that the discourse, the Brahmanical discourse of this country operates on, where the fuel is the graphic representation of Dalit bodies, harmed Dalit bodies, harmed Muslim bodies. These are the fuel for this sort of status quo to continue operating, right? So when we come into that playing field and present, for example, one of my major series is called "What Does a Dalit Look Like?" And in that series, I just present people, normal people resting, for example, right? And this is not an image that we have had in how many ever years. There is no image of a Dalit person simply resting that has occurred in the history of one of the most enriched civilizations of all times, right? So yeah, so that's where my practice comes in, where I would actually want to do something, but that's 5 steps away. So in order to reach those 5 steps, I am the one who has to fill those holes in order to reach there. Yeah.
Thanks, Rahee. That really opens up the conversation, because when you were talking, I was thinking, so first of all, what you said about, this lack of a repository of Dalit motifs that exists, and so essentially part of your art practice, therefore, is also very consciously and also very necessarily
Yeah.
archiving in a way,
Yeah.
to begin with that first step so that you can move beyond that, right? So of course the consciousness of that in your practice, I mean, I was looking at some of you had an exhibition in 21 and I was able to see it online yesterday.
Oh, great.
And
Yeah.
I was looking at the Phulan Devi image that you draw on the boat.
Yeah.
That was because I had the occasion of attending a presentation about, so because Phulan Devi has come into popular visual discourse again very recently, and a lot of graphic narratives, especially there's one very famous one which by a French author, I think, which has come out. And in general, even given meme culture and all of that, she's come in, and the way you had connected it to your personal life, it really struck me. And the way you put her on the boat and the whole narrative of the boat. So I mean, that I really enjoyed the shift, because at least in that particular graphic narrative, you had a white person, so there's still this hierarchy telling that story.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
And one more thing that you were talking about, I mean, that was really I mean, for me at least, it struck me a lot. What you said, that every artist, at least every artist who India recognizes as an Indian artist or who's in NGMA,
Yeah,
has created artworks of Gandhi, even
yeah,
Nehru. But
yeah,
the absence of Ambedkar, and
yeah,
just talking about NGMA, for instance, one of the things, like, I've visited many times, but something that always has struck me, and when I take students for walks there also, I always point out. So you have amazing artwork, yes,
mhm,
but the way in which, the depiction of the Adivasi body, for example,
yeah,
especially the woman,
yes,
it's very, so, what you were talking about in a more modern context about, the body,
yeah,
like the pain which has to be depicted, this kind of
yeah,
voyeurism. So
yeah,
one
absolutely.
thing is, like, recently I attended a panel discussion on, that was organized in our college, and we had Bezuwala Wilson who came in, and he
Right.
made a very important point that, that people, even, like, people, it's important to keep the discourse open, rather than say that people who don't belong to non-marginalized communities can't talk about,
Mhm.
marginalization. But, the point that you're making here, which is really important, which is this voyeurism in consuming,
Yeah,
the body of the communities which have been marginalized,
yeah.
and, always akin with pain. And since you talk, I didn't know that you've done this series. Maybe afterwards we could, like, you can tell us where we can take a look at it. Like, you
Yeah.
said, right? Who looks like a Dalit? Was that the name of the series?
What does a Dalit look like? It's on my Instagram. Like, yeah, it's
Okay.
sporadically across my like feed. Yeah, like
Okay,
across my
I'll go
feed.
back and check that, because I was thinking about the short film that came out again in 21, The
Mhm.
Discreet Charm of the Savarnas,
Right.
where, this group of people are looking to cast a Dalit looking person for their
Mhm.
film.
Mhm.
And, they have these expectations, about
Yeah.
what a Dalit looks like. And, the film, again, like, when I showed it to students, there was always this expectation of pain, what
Mhm.
you just talked about. What they
Mhm.
didn't expect was the humor and the satire with which the filmmaker had
Yeah.
pushed everything through. But of course, definitely the I think it makes the responsibility for you so much
Mhm.
more.
Yeah.
Like what you were saying, that you have to archive, you have to do more, much more.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'll just put questions to both of you now. This is combining questions that the students have sent, and also some questions, that I, just, like, came up with. So first of all, the students really wanted to know why, choose to tell stories of resistance or dissent, through the visual medium. This is something that, they seem to be very keen on knowing about. So if you could, either of you, if either you or Orijit could step in, or you could have a conversation with each other. So yeah.
Should I go, Rahee?
Yeah. Sure.
Uh, I think there is at one level there's an obvious answer to that, which is, at least as far as I'm concerned, visual language is the language uh, I am committed to. I've spent my whole life using, and so anything that matters to me, I feel like expressing that visually. So as an artist, it's really not a choice. It's almost like a non-choice, because the visual medium is my medium. At another level, of course, when we kind of look at, let's say, discourse in visual versus non-visual, let's say textual or other forms, I think visuality has the power of being able to communicate several messages at the same time. And I always find that text has this linearity where you just can't read it. You have to read it in sequence. You have to build up an argument or something, sentence by sentence, and the reader has to read that in that same order in order to make sense of what is being said. I think the visual medium is powerful because it can talk about many things at the same time, and also allow the viewer to interpret those.
Orijit, we've sort of lost you. Okay, while we wait to get Orijit back, Rahee, would you like
Sure.
to talk? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like to go back to like what you were speaking about, like in response to like my like what I said. Uh, I mean, the obvious thing is then to like I said, like to be the simultaneous historian, curator, and creator of this repository of
Yes.
images, right? Like that is like something that is incredibly interesting. Like that is something that is incredibly vital for the like history of images. Like like for example, how uh, even now I'm sure like because of our implicit biases, like most people who are here at some point or the other, when they have heard the word Dalit or when they have heard the word scheduled caste, like they have had an image built inside their head, right, inside their psyche, like which is a very derogatory, very problematic image, so to speak, right? So so like to escape that image, to escape that sort of history is precisely what needs to be done, and yeah, so that is where
Okay, I think we've lost Rahee now. Orijit, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back, so I'll carry on from where I
Uh,
left off.
yeah, I think we've lost Rahee. He also mentioned he would be having some network issues. Students, if you could just text him. But I think the point that Rahee was concluding, and I think definitely students, please do think about this, that visuals as a necessary counter to the way the imagination is, kind of always, like your imagination is always already in a particular kind of ideology. The way in which we imagine, the way we use visuals in our own imagination as something as being already hegemonized, and thinking of visual as a necessary counter when we're looking at Rahi's art practice or Orijit's. Okay. Okay, I think Rahee will be rejoining. So, Orijit, let me put the next question to you, and then we can ask Rahee to comment on it when he joins back. So, one of the things that the students, would like to know, and as would I, what do you keep in mind when you're using visual stories to memorialize stories of resistance? If you could offer some thoughts on technique, or even offer some guidance to young artists here about if there's something you keep in mind, or how you approach visuals as an artist. So maybe some comments on technique or and so on.
I think one important factor is in all my work is what could be called visual research, as in when I create stories, I take a lot of care to research it in terms of normally research is thought of in terms of collecting information of a certain type uh, in academic sense. But for an artist, visual research means understanding the visual, the realities of the visual space in which your story is set, or whatever you're trying to say is being shown. You need to kind of look at. I literally go and make like it's like doing research, but I do a collection. Like for example, if my story is set in, let's say, somewhere, I mean, let's say in a neighborhood of Delhi, then I would go to that neighborhood first and collect stories from people, meet people, draw from life, observe things, and one of the primary means of observation is drawing. So, in a sense, building up a kind of a visual vocabulary of the context and the setting and the specifics of the people, characters, also collecting their memories and their stories, of course, is a very important part of creating a visual narrative. It's like the basis on which you build by actual one-on-one connection. And today, fortunately, we also have things like Google, which allow us to supplement that with, and I use that a lot also. But I think it all begins, and my brain starts ticking when I actually go out and meet people. I interact with them. I sit with people. I explore spaces. I walk around streets, making notes, making drawings and sketches. And also, of course, it becomes vice versa, kind of a
Thanks, Orijit. Rahee, can you hear us?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Like I just lost my Wi-Fi, so I connected from another system. Yeah, you can hear me,
Yeah,
right?
we can hear you. So the
All right.
question that I had put to both of you here is, if you could tell us a little bit, like especially from the perspective of many young artists and researchers who are attending this session today, that like any things to keep in mind when you're thinking about visual storytelling, especially when we're thinking about visual storytelling that has a particular political, thought behind it. If you could, like Origi talked about visual research,
Right.
which is a very important part. So if you could just share from your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, as somebody who like has a inbuilt cynicism toward uh, what a subject matter can be vis-a-vis, like most of the time, like there is this sort of idea that what becomes a pertinent subject, what becomes a pertinent topic to research, like when it comes to politics, when it comes to political like resistance and so on and so forth, are is something that is outside of us, like because the way, like urban elite spaces, like such as, like like every one of us, like operates largely within urban elite spaces now, right? uh, so so what we tend to, like perceive, what especially the Savarna gaze, like which you talked about in reference to Rajesh's film, like what the Savarna gaze perceives of as political, of as resistance, etc., tends to be something that is outside of us. But I think that so yeah, so like like I, as somebody who's cynical, like having seen far too many times that very exact same thing being done to disastrous consequences, I would say that the golden rule should perhaps be to assume and thoroughly understand that that is not where the political lies. Like the political lies in the design of things around you, like like you hold the thing next to you, and that's where the political can be excavated from, right? So I think that the methodological impetus must exist, when anybody is trying to create a graphic art, like or create like some sort of a narrative. Like that sort of impetus should be there to be able to excavate the politics of something that is right next to you, that is your own, right? As opposed to trying to think, oh, like this is an issue that I need to have an opinion about. Because I assure you, like as deeply sociological beings like who exist in society, we do, like all sorts of networks and matrices intersect and coincide with our being. So in that sense, like no matter what the subject matter you choose, it will have a political core, it will have a like complex sort of history which can lead to, yeah, like drawing resistance and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Thanks, Rahi. I personally feel that that's an incredibly important point that you've made there, because definitely also as somebody who's also an artist, I do feel that there is always a danger of fetishizing resistance itself when we're
Yes,
talking about
absolutely.
representation.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a very important point that you're making, and I hope students are taking note of this. Another question that I would like to put to both of you is that both of you enjoy a large follower base and fan base on social media, and like how have you felt social media impacting your art practice? And I'll just combine this with something the students were also asking. Do you feel that that social media, like how do you feel that social media has changed the art world? Especially because the concept note that the students have written, it talks about how the publishing world, also like the art world, there are a lot of hierarchies, and we know this. So what do you like, how do you feel about social media as changing art practice, and also like in general, but also in particular for yourselves? So whoever, whoever would like to respond.
Okay, I can go. I think social media has been a pretty significant change, has made a change to the way I create art. Uh, One of the main things being that mm, in in pre-social media uh, time, I didn't really have too much say or control over what kind of content and context in which my art would be seen. It depended on either a person who was willing to show it in their galleries, or it would be a publisher who would publish my work. And in each of these situations, whatever they may be, from the publishing world to the art world to other spaces, there was always obviously a kind of an editorial interference of some sort, as in to say there was either an overt or covert agenda under which my art would appear, either as part of some kind of a whatever. I mean, somebody had to put themselves behind my work, and there was in that sense I couldn't really put my work out there directly to my audiences or viewers or whoever wish to. And this is a huge change with social media, that you can actually do that. You don't really have any intermediaries. You, of course, you have all the social media policing and all that goes on. However, there's nothing to prevent you from putting it out. What happens when you put it out, what kind of reactions, and whether people attempt to police what you say or don't say, is a different matter. But the fact is that social media creates a space for us to be able to create artworks that speak to the things that concern us, and there is no kind of editorial sort of a layer that comes in between what I do and how my audience receives it. So if I have to just kind of put it into one kind of main element that differentiates what difference the social media has made for my art practice, it's that I have, it's like an relatively open space for artists to put out and say what they want to. Then the trolling or policing or censoring comes after that, but at least you are able to reach out.
Thanks, Orijit. Rahee?
Yeah, I think the major difference between Orijit's work, which has primarily been visual to start with, so in his case, like he's sort of integrating his already existent like artwork to the Instagram like economy or the like social media economy, whereas I'm somebody who started essentially creating for the social media space. So in that sense, the crucial difference is that I don't begin with the idea that I mean I'm saying this in a light way, but like in some sense there is this sort of pressure to not create art but to create content, right? So that's like the primary thing, and when you are somebody who's primarily creating work on social media, there are all these sort of implicit algorithmic biases which you have to take into account, right? Because like if you are somebody who deals with a particular set of political like hashtags, etc., and you're like, and then like you don't post regularly, then the algorithm immediately starts to assume that like the algorithm essentially shadow bans you, right? So so there is this sort of pressure to constantly be within that sort of cycle of relevancy which you have to do. And secondly, the formal part of it also is fundamental, because a lot of us, and this is something that I felt when I graduated, by taking the images that I had created for Instagram, and then to a gallery space, which is what the exhibition that you were talking about, the exhibition in 21. So when I to take these images into making prints and hanging them within a gallery, I realized that all of them are in the aspect ratio which fits the Instagram aesthetic the best, right? So, and that is not something that one would think of when they are hanging it in a gallery, because there is this sort of sparseness which you can introduce, you can play with the ratio and so on and so forth. So yeah, so that is I think something that implicitly a lot of the artists who exist online, we tend to our very idea of how to frame an image is sort of getting morphed into a very, very narrow sort of dimension. Yeah. And yeah, as far as the good parts of social media are concerned, obviously, whatever Orijit said, there is this sort of absolute plurality of voices that can exist now. I mean, 2-3 years ago, an artist for 4-5 years ago, an artist like me would not be saying the things constantly that I am saying now, right? So that's something that social media itself has facilitated. So yeah.
Also, I think social media has this amazing feedback loop possible, uh, because in any other situation, when an artist shows work in a published book, or there isn't really a feedback system. I mean, people can't
Yeah,
respond. The audiences can't respond, or even if they do, at most they'll be polite and say that's very nice or whatever. But I think social media encourages people, and it creates all these multiple feedback loops where people comment, and because the possibility of anonymous commenting, it also allows people to be honest, and then other people to react to it. So I think art becomes social media has allowed art to become like a focus of discourse, conversation, dialogue, exchange.
Yeah.
While earlier art was very much a creator, right, the artist versus the viewer or participant or whatever, and it was much more one-sided, linear in a sense.
Absolutely. I think I'll just ask one final student, and then we can open it up to the comments, which is that as artists, how do you negotiate with your art practice in times of increasing censorship that we are seeing online? And in general, how are you as artists able to negotiate that? The students also wanted to know, you know, because especially like you were talking about the different feedback loops, and how social media has also, one of the benefits has been about democratizing the way art is circulated. So also in terms of how sometimes art can also be misconstrued. So if you could both comment about that, about censorship, and also like you did mention about trolling and so on, but the other side of that feedback loop.
I think, I mentioned feedback loops as being both positive, potentially positive or potentially negative. I wasn't kind of distinguishing between the two kinds. And I don't think one needs to. Also, I do think that art should be, and in the long run, even outside of the social media world, that is what art is. I mean, if art has some relevance or meaning, it comes from how people see it, view it, and think about it. Ultimately, the artist slowly really does not matter beyond a point. The artwork does, because the artwork is the vehicle. And so if an artwork is powerful in the context of where it's seen and viewed, it will have an impact, and it will affect people. It may influence discourse or some form of change in people's attitudes. And if it is not, then automatically it by itself will cease to be relevant beyond a point. And so I think the point is that as artists, we should not take too much claim or credit on what we do. It is something that is a response to a time and a place and a situation. And of course, when you're responding with all your heart and soul, and you're putting in all your whatever energy, creativity, thoughts, etc. into it. But once it's out there, it can mean different things to different people, and that's what it should mean. I mean, it's not you don't have any control. You're not the one who decides how people should read something. And so which is why as an artist you only grow if you have these loops of feedback where people are commenting positively, negatively, or sharing or criticizing, or all of these things help actually the artist more than one would imagine.
Thanks, Orijit. Rahee, if you'd like to share your thoughts.
Yeah, I have sort of like a two-pronged answer to the censorship question. Like one is like a more general existential one, and the other is like the practical aspect of it. So generally speaking, like existentially speaking, like I do not feel pressurized by the question of censorship at all, because as somebody, as a Dalit body in elite spaces, you are pretty much, the moment you're introduced to society, you are censoring yourself, right? This is the reason why Yashika Dutt has to write a book called Coming Out as Dalit, so like there is this sort of intricate sort of like like this sort of code which we are taught in our households, this sort of code which we are forced almost to like impose upon ourselves, this sort of hidden being that we have to exist as, which sort of takes over constantly, like in schools, in family functions, in, and then like in colleges, and like like public spaces of all sorts of kind. So yeah, so to exist freely itself is a fantasy in many ways for most people in this country. And this is obviously true for people who are Adivasi, people who are like like from yeah, Muslim communities, and so on and so forth, right? So like there is so yeah, so as far as the question of censorship is concerned, like like the net gain slash loss, like loss, if we calculate, there has always existed a form of censorship or the other, like inside our heads constantly, like so yeah, so like it doesn't really matter, like what censorship, like it's always been there, like no big deal. But as far as the practical aspect of it is concerned, like this is something that Dilip Mandal constantly says, that Dilip Mandal, the reporter slash like cultural analyst, he constantly says, which is that no matter how radical your politics, no matter how radical your thought, I assure you, the in like the history, like the history of this the anti-caste discourse in this movement, in this country, like starting with Sant Ravidas, and like moving on to Jyotirao Phule, Savitribai Phule, like Dr. Ambedkar, and so on and so forth. I like he says that I assure you, like they have already said it, so the things that you think are radical, the things that you think are censorship worthy, chances are that Periyar has definitely said it, chances are that Dr. Ambedkar has definitely said it, right? So like instead of saying them as if there is some sort of like or an organic reality to what you're saying, like just like be a keen student of the anti-caste movement's history, and the chances are that then you can sort of quote yourself, like COAT, quote yourself in the armor of these massive intellectuals who have passed before you, right? So that's the more practical sort of day-to-day handle of it, like which obviously a lot of Dalit artists online like take great care to, like we constantly keep quoting people rather than like presenting our woe as a organic sort of like this came to me. So yeah, so that sort of helps us from being away from the censorship part of it largely, yeah, being under the wrath of law directly. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have one point about censorship which I wanted to make, is that ultimately self-censorship is the worst form of censorship. And I think a lot of authorities, not just in India today, but wherever censorship is being practiced widely, which is almost everywhere, in some form or the other, the objective of those who censor is to actually get you to a point where you start censoring yourself, because then they don't have to bother about censoring you, you will censor yourself. And I remember, for example, Penguin, a big publishing house, multinational publishing house like Penguin, sort of pulping all its copies of Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus, in fear of some random outfit from some small place which is just like a right-wing group that's trying to say that we will not tolerate this. And they can have such an influence on a big publishing house that they actually pulp all the copies of that book. To my mind, that is what self-censorship does. It creates an aura of, I mean, the authorities are able to create an aura of fear and suspicion to a point where people are afraid to say whatever they would like to say, or publishers, not just individuals, but publishers will come to a point where they will not publish certain things. I've had several art galleries, upon seeing my proposal, they have, after inviting me to exhibit at their gallery, after seeing my proposal, they step out saying that, no, this is too radical for us. So this whole idea that institutions, organizations, people, individuals, everybody starts to shut themselves up. So I think that is ultimately the ultimate censorship. I mean, the government doesn't have to do that much. People just go around censoring themselves. So this is the kind of trend or censorship thing that we have to fight against. And the only way to do that is put yourself out there and say the things that you wish to say without thinking of the consequences as far as possible.
Thank you both, especially for, I mean, I think the last part of the discussion really took it into practical aspects of the art practice in relation to telling the stories that we want to tell. And of course, when we're talking about censorship, to think about also, the notion of self-censorship, and also sometimes like Rahee was talking to us about the fact that self-censorship is sometimes also, to not self-censor is also a tremendous luxury. So I think, thank you both. I think it's been a very rich discussion. I've been told that we are, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the time assigned today. I would just like to hand over to the student conveners to give the vote of thanks. But before I do that, again, thank you, Orijit and Rahee, for taking out the time and sharing so much about your art. And I've definitely learned a lot today. I hope the students have as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Payal. Thank
It
you.
was my pleasure, and to talk to all of you. It was great listening to you, Rahee. Lovely insights. Thank you. And thanks, Payal, for your really nice questions and moderation and leading the discussion into a nice direction.
Thank you so much, sir. Can someone confirm if I'm audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So on behalf of the English Literary Society of Miranda House, I would like to extend our gratitude to both of our panelists, Orijit Sen and Rahee Punyashloka. Thank you so much for taking out the time to speak with us, for showcasing your artwork, for doing the presentation, for answering our questions. We were delighted to have you over. And thank you so much to the moderator for the evening, A.P Payal. Thank you, ma'am, for being so kind as to accept our invitation. And last but not the least, I would also like to thank the audience. We also had some faculty members over. We have the Big Fat Bow attending the event. So thank you so much. We were delighted to have everyone here. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Principal Ma'am, Dr. Vijay Lakshmi Nanda, for giving us the platform to conduct our annual literary festival. And we're so sorry that we ran out of time, but some people were wondering if the panelists could share their artwork and their presentation. So if they're fine with it, they can email us that and we can hand it over to the participants and they can go through the presentation. And with that, I'll take your leave. Thank you so much to everyone for being present here. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. It was really enriching. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.